It sounds like a really beginnery question to ask, what do I do with ace king when I miss the flop? But this is actually not such a simple topic. And it's not just ace king, of course, that this question is relevant to, but by exploring 6 hands today where I've actually missed the flop with ace king. Most of these are 3-bet pots, they're quite large pots. Some of them involve big bluffs, some of them involve just checking down. Others involve turning the hand into some sort of bluff catcher. The point is that there are so many ways you could play ace king when you miss a flop, and they're so dependent on a series of variables that you really have to get good at identifying. We're going to answer this age-old poker question today and become masters of how to handle ace king when it misses, as it feels like it always does. But not just that, how to think about the theory of the game in general so that we can understand our relative hand strength and the highest EV play with other hands too, not just ace king. Let's get started. How to play ace king when you miss the flop. This first hand is a nice example. This extremely meticulous opponent decides to go ahead and open to 4.98. That is the only sizing that works, guys. All of the other sizes are bad. This is the GTO only option that you can do if you want to be a crusher. If you make it 4.97 or 4.99, I'll know that you're not a GTO expert, and I'll know that you're probably bad at poker. So this guy finds exactly the right sizing. Well done, villain. I'm being sarcastic. It doesn't really matter how big you go here. This is a bit pedantic. So we go to 22 bucks. Villain calls. Onto the flop of 5-6-3. This flop is going to eradicate and erode much of our pre-flop range advantage that we gained by 3-betting out of the small blind. So the fact that we had hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks does still matter, but it doesn't matter quite as much when there are 3 set making cards now available, creating 9 combos of sets that are in villain's range, but not our range. We don't go ahead and 3-bet out of the small blind with hands like 4s in this position, particularly frequently, or 3s or deuces or something, or 5s. So this is a board that allows villain to catch up in terms of equity and sort of neutralize the pre-flop range disadvantage that they suffered from. However, one good thing is that we do have a nut advantage here. So my main strategy in this spot would be that if I'm c-betting, I'm c-betting big, but I wouldn't c-bet very frequently. And that's because range advantage is the thing that makes us want to c-bet often in game theory, and that's not really present here anymore. However, we do still have the overpair advantage, and I know they're not technically the nuts. I'm saying nut advantage using this Carrot Poker School term, but the problem is that you shouldn't really obsess about the literal nuts. We call that the literal nuts fallacy, where students say, oh, well, sets are the nuts, so villain has the nut advantage. The thing is that the stack to pot ratio, we're not that concerned with getting stacked by a set. If it happens, it happens. When we have kings and he has 6s, we're just supposed to lose a lot of money, so that's the way it's supposed to go. We decide to check this time. As I say, you can play ace king in so many different ways here. You can bet big, and if you do that, the hand is what I call a hybrid. It will be a value bet against certain hands that call, that it dominates. Villain will have to defend some ace-queen combos, backdoor clubs, 1 spade hands, things like just ace-queen of hearts that have a lot of showdown value against our range. He'll have to call a lot of hands that are worse than this and can showdown and we can win against. And moreover, he'll have to call some hands that we can actually dominate here. The other thing that I would say is that when you bet here, although villain doesn't really fold a better hand to like a B60, a 60% pot size bet, villain could definitely fold some hands that give us useful fold equity. Protection is not the be all and end all of poker. It's really not a huge deal, but it is a thing and it does matter to some extent. If your fold equity was fully useless here because villain's range was either something completely dominated or something that beat you, there'd be absolutely no sense in betting. But because villain's range does contain hands like queen 10, 10-9, jack 10, jack 9 suited, etc. perhaps, you're going to go ahead and harvest some useful fold equity when those hands fold. To answer this question of how should you play ace king when you miss this flop, you can bet big as a hybrid value bluff denial bet. You can check raise as a hybrid bluff value denial check raise, and you can also check call as a showdown value bluff catcher. This is a very nice bluff catcher on the flop because it dominates some bluffs. It has implied odds when both players bink a turn. You know, he hits king queen, but we've got ace king and we stack him, that sort of thing. And it also does another thing that's really, really nice here, which is it gives us the chance to redraw against villain's value range. So when you have the kind of bluff catcher that can redraw against the value bet, but can also just hold up really well against the bluffing range and dominate those bluffs, you have a really strong bluff catcher. So when we check the flop here, we're not going to be check folding. That's not really going to be the plan. We're going to either be check raising or check calling, and both of those are fine, as betting would be too. When the 7 turn comes, don't freak out, you know, don't be like, oh no, this is disgusting, and just panic. Yes, this is not a good board for your range, but your opponent has checked back on the flop and their range is going to contain many hands like jack 10, queen jack, etc. One of the reasons that we talked about betting flop for was value, and the other one was denial. Both of those things are now less necessary. When villain checks back on the flop, they move away from pocket pairs, hands that beat us, but they also move away from having things like 10-9 of clubs, queen jack, queen 10. These are hands that should bluff the flop pretty frequently. What they move towards is just things that are dominated here. Ace queen, ace jack, stuff like that will check back pretty frequently. So our equity has actually gone up due to the action sequence here, even though this card is clearly like better for villain's range than it is for ours. I find that my students spend far too much time obsessing over who the turn is good for. They almost play the turn as if action sequence isn't relevant, pre-flop ranges aren't relevant, and the only thing that matters is what the 7 does. That's an extremely tunnel vision, short-sighted thought process. It's not that the 7 is irrelevant, but it's certainly far from the be-all and end-all of this spot. I don't think we can value bet now. When our equity goes up and when we move closer to showdown, a couple of things happen. One is that the fold equity we're getting is now less useful than it would have been on the flop. To understand this statement, think about villain having a hand like 10-9 or jack-10 or queen-jack or something like that. And the non-flush draw variance is what I mean here. So imagine villain has queen-jack of diamonds. On the flop, that hand is going to have about 23% equity against our ace-king. Don't quote me on that, but it's going to be something like that depending on the suits. On the turn, it's going to have far less. If we cause villain to fold the queen-jack of diamonds here, that's way less useful than it would have been on the flop, therefore. The other thing is that because our hand has now been demoted a little bit in terms of its ability to value bet, so the 7 has improved a bunch of other hands in villain's range to being very strong, and it's also left the 0 very weak, our opponent is now more polarized than you would expect here, and we have an extremely mediocre equity hand. When you have the middle of your range on the turn or on the river, you shouldn't bet. Almost always. There's very, very few situations where you should be betting the middle of your range on the turn or the river when your opponent is playing relatively normally or competently. So this is a very automatic and clear check. Bluffing is out of the question. The hand has far too high a check EV. People say don't bluff with showdown value. That's kind of right, but let's just talk about why that is. When you bluff, you say no thank you to the line of checking. You turn down that line as an option. So when you bluff, you choose a line over checking. If you choose a box over another box, it is important what is in the box that you chose, but it also matters what was in the box that you declined. If I offer you $100 and $200 and you take the $100 because that's a decent amount of money, you're kind of missing the point of comparing your options. So if we were to bet here, while you could formulate some shallow argument like villain checked back the flop, or I'm going to rep an overpair, or my range still has overpairs in it, or I could have ace 4, all of these arguments are garbage, trash, dog shit. Don't use them. Just say I have the middle of my range, I have mediocre equity, I can't value bet, I can't bluff, done. Simply done. People overcomplicate how to play hands like ace-king when they miss the flop because their heads are swimming with all these nonsensical arguments. We talked about how much we'd like to unpack the poker backpack, get rid of all of this horrible clutter in the first episode of Poker Distilled. Let me tell you a bit about Poker Distilled, the new podcast from Carrot Corner, right now. Guys, if you like poker and you like podcasts, you will definitely want to check out the Poker Distilled podcast, now available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Carrot Corner, Poker Education YouTube channel, and multiple other places. Poker Distilled is a 1-hour show. There's one episode every week. It comes out on a Monday. And in Poker Distilled, myself and my co-host Melissa will take you on a philosophical and psychological journey through many of the most fascinating aspects of this game that we know and love, and how those relate more broadly and deeply to real life and simply the condition of human existence. If this sounds to you like something you might enjoy listening to on your daily commute or some other point during your day, then why not give it a listen? That's Poker Distilled. It's completely free, and we hope you enjoy it. Now let's get back to the video. And so in this situation, you check. It might seem obvious, but I think it's well worth illustrating this because people do make mistakes at this spot. 3 on the river, again, you should assess your equity. There are 3 possibilities here. Either you have enough equity to value bet and consider doing that. Doesn't mean you have to. You could have a mediocre hand that must check due to its mediocrity and just middling equity. In other words, check is worth quite a lot of the pot, so turning the hand into a bluff is worth less than the pot due to the extra risk that's basically taken on when you risk extra money by trying to make your opponent fold. Thirdly, you could say that your hand is so low down that the best thing you can do here is bluff, and that you think the fold equity in this spot, theoretically, or maybe exploitatively, is sufficient for that. Pause the video, have a think about it. What should you do with this hand on the river? Unpause the video. That's right, guys. You nailed it, or at least I hope you did. You should absolutely check here. Doing anything else is crazy. If you bet, you will get close to 0 fold equity against stronger hands. People are not going to this river with pocket 8s to fold. They're not going to this river with pocket 8s in this way in general very frequently, but if they did, they're certainly not doing that to fold very often. I don't think it's impossible that you could get called by ace queen here if you value bet. I actually think the spot is closer to a value bet than the bluff, but I think it's a check. And I think this is a spot where if you guys are playing like 25 NL or something, you're not playing against crushers like the 200 NL pool. Okay, they're not crushers, but they're very strong compared to 25 NL players. Then you're going to do very well in this spot when you check and face a bet, because villain is going to be extremely capped and over bluffing, not bluffing enough earlier, which means that they take too many of their air combos to the river and then probably over bluffing. So in this example, villain actually had one of the hands we could value bet against on the flop or on the turn or on the river, but we can't be tunnel visioned like that. You can't play against only ace of spades, queen of diamonds, because of course there could also have been some 10-9, jack-10, queen-jack air hands in villain's range. And because villain's range did contain a lot of air still, the check on the river and then just planning to call with this lovely bluff catcher is going to do really well at all stakes. This is an overbluff node. People are not good at delaying their value bets, and they do get here with too much air. So definitely looking to check call that river. Okay, that's one hand down, 5 to go. We have a limp here. This hand is a lot simpler, not much to say about this one really, but it is instructive. We go for the 5x ISO, which I think is good. This player is 32-8, right? So very, very passive trending so far. And that's going to be really relevant. We want to bear that in mind when it comes to the flop. Now, here's a way to go really wrong in this spot. Let me impersonate, you know it guys, the GTO nerd. We love the GTO nerd. Let's impersonate this character one more time here for good measure. So they may say something like,
"Oh yes, well, this board is okay for my range, and I'm just going to bet my range here for 1/3 pot. I'm going to big bet because I got a nut advantage. Yes, ha."
And when they say those things, what they're doing is they're playing their whole range the same way. When they say I'm going to range bet here for 1/3 pot, what they're saying is that they're playing their whole range the same way against the 32/8 VPIP PFR. If you don't play online poker much, that means that villain has played 32% of the hands they've been dealt and raised 8% of the time they had the chance to raise before the flop. In this situation, we have to form the conclusion that that's crazy. Why on earth would you want to play all of your hands the same way against a fish? Why would you want to ignore the information of what your cards are against a fish?
Well, because I have range advantage.
How does that translate to this hand being better to bet than to check? I don't think it does. I don't think betting is bad here, and I did decide to bet, and I decided to bet tiny, but let me justify my play here. Let me talk you through my thought process here so you can see how to actually come to a conclusion about what might be the highest EV line, rather than just rattling off some completely ingrained arbitrary thought processes about ranges. You can do way better than that when you're playing against a weaker player. Effectively, in theory, as a baseline, it's as good to bet as it is to check. We talked about this before. On a board like this, ace-king actually trends much closer to a value bet than a bluff. It's not really a bluff at all. It's some sort of very thin value bet that also gains implied odds later on an ace or king turn, which is fantastic. It's amazing here. Much, much better to hit the turn on this texture than it would have been on the last one. And the other reason we can obviously bet the hand for is denial. We're getting the jack-10 and the king, the queen-jack and the 7-8 suited and stuff like that to fold, which does clean up quite a lot of equity. So loads of reasons that you can bet this hand for in theory. You can also check it. You can check raise. You can check call, same as before. Lots of stuff you can do. So in practice, those won't have the same EV. There'll be one that's better than the other against a weaker player, and that's why your job is to really sort of buckle down here and try to figure out which line is best. So let's go through them. If we check what's likely going to happen from a 32-8, they're probably going to play quite transparently. We don't know exactly how transparently, but I would think that they do less bluffing than most player types, which automatically sort of decreases the temptation of check calling. I'm no longer as keen to check call here when I think they're going to be under bluffing. I'm less keen to check raise as well because I think my fold equity could be less if they do bet here. And therefore I'm just a bit more willing to favor the branch where I get a bit of value and a bit of denial. It's not sufficient to say I can bet for value and denial, therefore I bet, because then you're not thinking about check. So again, what I'm doing here is I've been offered two boxes, bet and check, and I'm looking inside the bet box in my head here and trying to work out roughly how good that is. Then I'm looking inside the check box and doing the same thing. I'm not just going, oh, that box has a pretty ribbon on it, I choose this. That's what people do in poker. They just choose a box because of one thought. Just because you have a thought, let's call it A, that leads in direction X, that doesn't mean that A is sufficient for X. For A to be sufficient for X, it has to render X the best thing to do, and it doesn't single-handedly do that. You having a range advantage here doesn't single-handedly determine that betting is better than checking. A is not sufficient for X, so try and remember that. We bet, villain folds. Much ado about nothing, long story short. What we did here is that we made a very thin value bet, we denied equity, and we chose that line because we thought the check line to check raise or check call, both of those branchings of the check line would underperform against someone that looked very passive. General rule, when you're against someone who's really passive, try to make thin value bets, be more on that end of the spectrum where you're keen to make thin value bets, and try not to have too much of a proclivity to actually bluff catch or induce or play your hand in a way where you're hoping villain is over bluffing. That's not going to happen as often. Next hand. Classic spot. Small blind versus button. We 3-bet ace king, button calls. Queen 9-5. We c-bet. This is a board you could use big or small c-bets on because your nut advantage is a little bit devalued by the presence of the queen, and that's simply just because villain does have ace, queen, king, queen here. They can catch up and overtake your tens and jacks and stuff like that. So you still have a decent nut advantage here. You could use big bets in theory, you could use small. This is definitely a board that's quite good for you. It's not going to be a range bet in GTO, I don't think, although it would be like fairly high bet frequency. So we're just betting ace king often here. Why are we betting ace king? What was that thing we said about betting the middle of your range? That's mainly on the turn in the river. On the flop, equities are so close together, there's so much realization still to happen, that your fold equity is always much more useful on the flop than it would be on the turn or on the river. In fact, your fold equity on the river, when you have a mediocre hand, is usually entirely useless because the hands that fold are dead. They're losing all the time to you. So this bet is fine. I would say that it's closer to a bluff than a value bet this time. The way to understand that this is now closer to a bluff is, well, if you can imagine plenty of combos of better hands than your hand folding, then your hand is definitely moving towards bluff domain. So again, one of the big skills when it comes to playing a hand like ace king is being able to ask yourself, is this a value bet? Is this a bluff? Are there elements of both? How much denial is there if villain folds? Like, how useful is the fold equity if villain folds? Did I just like give you guys the middle finger? I was actually counting reasons. I didn't mean that. Maybe I did, who knows? Do like the video, by the way. Speaking of putting up fingers and thumbs to things that you like, do like the video, smash the like button, let us know that you like this content. Give us a comment, let me know that this is the sort of video you want to see again, and guess what, there's a way higher chance you're going to see this video again. So don't just sit there thinking, oh, I hope he does more of these. Tell me, ask and thou shalt find, and all of that stuff. Do it. So yeah, kind of a bluff, closer to a bluff than a value bet for sure, but there's all kinds of different elements going on the flop here, and sometimes on the flop you can bet for multiple reasons at once, but those reasons are not to represent the queen, guys. Never represent the queen. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear representing going on in this channel or in my community at all, because it's trash. Anyway, on to the turn. We barrel. So to understand our hand strength on the turn, you know, like, why are we able to bet this time, but we weren't betting before on that lower texture, the 6-5-4 deuce? It's not because that texture is terrible for range. That's not really it. It's because ace king had far more showdown value after that action sequence in that previous hand than it does here. So in the previous hand, the first one we looked at, we had middling equity on the turn, and that was partly because villain hadn't filtered as they've done here. When they call the flop, we have to understand at the bottom of their range, stuff like ace-10 of spades is going to disperse at quite a high frequency. It's going to land in the muck. Villain has a folding range, pocket fours, it's going to end up in the muck. What that means is that this hand is now doing a bit worse in terms of absolute equity than it would after an action sequence of check on the flop, where villain's range remains unfiltered, uncontracted, uncondensed. So because they've condensed on the flop by calling the c-bet here, this hand is now going to show down for very, very little of the pot whatsoever. Villain can actually bluff us off of this hand on the river because their range is strengthened. We're just going to really struggle to show down for much pot share, which means that bluffing is really good. And this might actually be a pure bluff. And the way to really get super technical about this is to like look at your suits and see if you block the king queen suited and queen jack suited and stuff with your broadways, whatever you have. But let's not even get into that today. Let's just say that when you have blockers to king queen off, ace queen off, all that sort of stuff, ace queen suited, you can definitely barrel. You have 2 live cards if you do get called by pocket pair region and stuff like that. This is a really clear double barrel. It's fine to barrel here. I don't know that it's pure in a solver. I don't know that a solver always does it, but I would expect it's quite hard to defend here. If villain sometimes has to call a hand again like pocket 8s here at some frequency, and I suspect they probably do actually, maybe, depends on our sizing, this could easily get overfolded. So I think this barrel is really standard. It's just about understanding that in this particular case, ace king is quite low showdown value, but good redraw, decent blockers, out of position, check EV is not going to be very high, showdown EV unimproved, they'll be very low, therefore bluffing is fine. We don't have too much showdown value to bluff here, like we did in the last example. In other words, the box of check is not so lucrative that we need to choose it in favor of the bet box. Bluff is going to be fine, and probably the best play actually. Ace king of diamonds here, our first ace king suited example. Get 3-bet by small blind, and we call in the cutoff. Sorry, we decide to slow play this time. Of course, this is a hand you could 4-bet. We are very deep here, like 200 bigs deep. I think this is the kind of hand that if it does get 5-bet at this stack depth, it really hates it. Obviously, it does not mind getting 5-bet at all, 100 BBs deep or 140 BBs deep, but 200 BBs deep, it starts to suffer a little bit. So I think flatting this at a decent frequency is fine. I think 4-betting is probably fine as well, and then just flatting the 5-bet, just sort of saying, hey, I have to continue, I'm going to flat the 5-bet if it comes to small 5-bet, that is. If villain jams, you're going to be indifferent, sadly. Or maybe even losing, depending what he's jamming. Anyway, I digress. 10-8-5 and villain check. So now we have this float bet opportunity, and here I would really ask myself, well, what's going on here range advantage wise? And I think our range is now the one with the disadvantage. When villain checks, if they're a competent player, they shouldn't be forfeiting all of their range advantage. They shouldn't be like, oh, I'm just checking king queen of spades to check fold and I'm betting all of my overpairs. But guess what, guys? If you play 25 NL or something, you'll come across loads of bad regs and bad recreationals that do that. But in this game, I have to give my opponent credit for check raising a ton, because that's a play that should happen here. This hand is very suspiciously middling. It's blocking villain's folding range. It's unblocking their raising range, meaning that if I bet here, I can get raised quite a lot, and this can actually deny my equity very badly. And this hand is actually victim to something I call... Not true EV, no, got you there. Something I call... the drop. No, we're not going to start that. That's true EV. But also the drop. The drop is a concept where your EV suddenly drops to 0. And if you fall from the first floor window of a flat, one time I had a bet with a friend that we played a computer game against each other, and the loser had to jump out of the first floor window into a jagged hedge. I won. He lost. That was the end of the night. He went back to his flat in the student accommodation, very upset and angry. And then I didn't see him for like a couple of days after that, so he jumped out of the window into the jagged hedge. And that kind of hurt, but imagine he'd had to jump out of the 4th floor window. Imagine our flat was on the top floor of the building instead. That would have been a really sick game, even more sadistic than it was already. But 18-year-old boys, I mean, what can you do? They're not adults yet. They're idiots, basically. We were idiots. But the point is that the harder you hit the ground, the higher you fall from, the more damage it's done. The thing about this hand is it's doing very well. The check EV of this hand is extremely good. So if you do bet here and reopen the action, so far in this video we've been out of position. When you're in position, betting comes at this extra cost that comes with this peril, that you are opening the action up again when you could have just taken a free card. I'm sure I check here, and I'm sure betting is a mistake here, because I don't think this hand is good enough to like make a pure value bet. Because we're in position, it's not worth reopening the action. And if we do bet and face a raise, the drop from that happening in EV is going to be severe. We're going to be falling out of the 3rd floor window, meaning check was really, really good. But now we've bet, we've encountered a raise, and our EV's been decimated. Going to 0 is much more painful if your EV was sky high before that. If we had a hand like, I don't know, king queen of spades here, I don't really care if I bet and get raised and have to fold as much, because the drop is less and then only jumping out of like the ground floor window. It's not going to hurt much. So easy check back. This is good, middle of range. I would say that it's a polarization error for me to bet this flop. On the king turn, this is obviously a good card for villain. It's not one that they always have to bet though. They still have mediocre hands here like 9s and stuff. So clearly they should have some kind of checking range. I think you could check here, you could also bet here. I don't have a strong preference. I don't think there's so much urgency against a good player to build this pot that you have to bet, because the good player will sometimes have a flush and will be trapping you and will have a set and you'll get check raised, and again there'll be a very big drop in EV. But I think against weaker players at lower stakes, that's not really much of a concern, and you just don't get check raised very often. So I decide to make it large here, but not massive, and just normal thing. I'm building my betting range around some really good value hands. My hand is clearly high enough in equity now to go for a value bet. There's nothing wrong with this. This is not a polarization error, so we do this, we get the fold. Not much to say. Ace king off this time, we go for the large 3-bet, big blind versus cutoff. No, I'm not going to talk about my sizing. You guys should go off and figure it out. Good luck, have fun with that. Let me know how you get on figuring out why my sizing is big. It's not 2007. That's one clue about why my sizing is big. Queen 9-3 with 2 hearts. Okay, another one of these flops where our range is doing okay. It's doing fairly well. It starts off less strongly here than it did when we were small blind, because when we're in the big blind, if we're constructing our 3-bet range properly, then we're actually going to have some really big equity hands, sure, but also some bluffs that are quite bad. We're going to have like the king 6 suited and stuff like that. Sometimes that's the thing about big blind. You get here with some weird junky hands. So definitely not like a full frequency bet spot, but betting quite often. We have the right suits here to just like do really well in big pots on runouts of these natures. We can bluff spade runouts. We can value bet heart runouts. When we make a 4 flush, we can bluff the 3 heart runout. Effectively, lots of good things going on with suits here, and we unblock the clubs and diamonds, which fold more often. So I think betting at high frequency with this hand is good. I don't mind checking it at all though, and I think that when you face a bet here, you should understand that, well, realistically, you have kings, aces, ace, queen, sets in this spot. You want to do a ton of check raise here. Whenever you're the out of position C better and 3 better, and you're considering betting the flop and you actually check and your opponent then bets, you're going to have a lot of check raise, especially against quarter pot stabs and third pot stabs. Even against this, you're going to have some check raises. Here, the drop, the concept of like what happens to me if I'm jammed on, it's not that bad, because I think against villains jamming range, I'm not performing amazingly well with this hand. I also block a lot of their jams if they have like ace 5 of hearts. Well, they don't have it in this iteration of the game tree because I have the ace of hearts. So yeah, pretty fine raise. Try to remember here that again, on this flop in GTO terms, you're going to have a load of options. You can bet big, you can bet small, you can check raise. Check call is probably also okay, although it might be slightly worse than check raise. I don't know if you can check fold with these suits. I think they're a little bit too good, although you maybe could against like a really big bet, such as a B75 or something. But yeah, this is a play that a lot of you guys probably never make. And when you never make this play, you're kind of forgetting that villain could just be stabbing random hands here. And when you make those fold, that's really useful to you. And also, you just have a lot going on here. You're going to block the stuff that's going to shove on you, and you're going to block flush draws that continue and then win the pot from you in some way later. And yeah, you're going to unblock hands like the king jack of diamonds that ostensibly just can't bet call here, right? They don't have enough equity. So that's nice. And you clean up some equity by making them fold the jack out, the 10 out here when they have that hand. Okay, final one, ace king off under the gun. I think this is the final one. No, it's not. Guys, you're in for a treat. There's 2 more hands. Kind of longer video than I thought. So jack 4-3, single raise pot now. From 3-bet pots to single raise pots. And then a single raise pot, you're going to have completely different parameters really for where you can value bet, where you can bluff, etc. I think here your hand is going to be played either as a small bet that's going to be like a value denial hybrid bet, or you can play it as a big bet, which is going to be more of a bluff denial hybrid bet. You're not going to get called by as many worse hands when you do that, but you can maybe get some pocket pair region to start folding, like deuces or 8s or something like that. Although 8s is probably a continue, maybe like 6s is indifferent, I don't know. But yeah, you can certainly play big bet, small bet, or check here. I actually play big bets on this texture, though it doesn't really matter. You can go both ways. It's not actually a huge deal. So we decide to go for the large bet here. Villain calls. On the turn, it's good to just take stock of our equity again, like where are we in terms of our equity of this hand against villain's range. And I think it's quite clear that we are kind of close to a hand that could start checking for showdown value. I think there is some showdown value here, and so checking back the turn is not totally unreasonable, but we're also kind of flirting with the idea of being able to bluff here. We're quite low down as well, and because it's not the river, we can bluff with a bit more showdown value than we would at the end of the hand, where the fold equity is squarely useless against the hands that we're ahead of. So here, if villain did float us on the flop with 5-6, or, okay, that hand probably raises our turn bet, bad example, but some gutter, let's say like ace deuce or 5-7 or something, it's probably totally fine to just bet here and clean up that equity sometimes, get villain to fold some hands that are live. We have the king of diamonds, which is fantastic here. Why is that good? Don't we want villain to have a flush draw? No, you don't. You don't want villain to have a flush draw, because the flush draw doesn't fold here, it raises you. Okay, if you go really big, you can maybe make a flush draw fold, but not a king high flush draw. The king high flush draw is going to raise you a ton. Like if villain gets here with king jack of diamonds, he'll call. And if he gets here with king 9 of diamonds, he's probably going to raise against your bet. So you have to be a little bit wary here, and remember this is actually a positive blocker. So I do go for the overbet here. I think that's the right sizing. The 8 is an incredibly great card for our range in terms of the nuts, because our nuts remain like fully uncapped. That means that if we had queens here, then queens is doing incredibly well on the 8. The 8 does not neutralize at all the whopping equity of 2 queens in the spot. So our value range wants to bet very big, so our bluffs follow suit. This is a bluff, but as I say, there's a bit of useful fold equity against weaker hands in villain's range too. And on the 10 of hearts river, sometimes people think that the king of diamonds now is a bad card to have. It's like a bad blocker or something. And I don't think this is really the case. Because if you think about it, what king high flush draws does villain get here with? Either king 10 or king jack. King queen maybe okay, but he doesn't have ace king, and like the lower king high flush draws will struggle to just call on the turn. They'll probably be raising flop or raising turn and splitting between those two actions. So actually this is not a negative blocker. I don't think this is causing any problems here. I don't think it's blocking any folds. In fact, it's probably just blocking calls like the king jack of diamonds. Villain wants to look us up with that because we're not by and large bluffing with that many diamond combos. So that's going to be a bluff catcher at some frequency. And then I don't think the ace of spades is a bad blocker at all. We're blocking like ace jack of spades or something, which is a hand that I'm quite happy to block here. It's a hand that could look us up. If you think about our value region here, I think we can have a couple of different value bets. If we have an overpair, I think we can just bet like something under pot. And if we have a set or queen 9 or 9-7 suited, I think we can just jam. Maybe we don't have 9-7 suited and hijack, but that's okay. Decide to jam this time. I think this will be a hard spot for villain to defend often enough in. They're not really going to have any sets now, apart from exactly pocket 10s, which is only a few combos. They can have some jack 10 that can call here, but I think this kind of like dramatic river all in can be quite hard to defend against. Some people will over defend here, some will under defend, but I don't think these blockers are like terrible for this. And if the solver thinks this is like slightly the wrong combo to do this with or something, I'm not that bothered. We do get it through. So that's an example where the showdown value of ace king is so low after the flop action sequence that we then turn the hand into a bluff on the turn in the river, and the diamond was a positive factor in all of that by blocking turn raises and then not blocking many river folds. Final hand, ace king of clubs, back to the suited domain. We go for an ISO here against a limp, seems normal. Villain calls and we get another, what is it with these jack high two-tone flops today, jack 7-3. We go for B60, which is the sizing, or B50 something. The sizing I use in a 3-bet pot on boards like this, where we have a bigger nut advantage. We've talked about that with the overpairs. You can definitely play this hand, again, as a check raise, as a check call, or as a bet. And because I'm betting very often here, just strategically, I'm probably going to bet. Now, this isn't a 3-bet pot, I should clarify, but the SPR is getting kind of similar. And the reason I actually choose this bet against a weaker player is that when it's an unknown weaker player, I actually had absolutely no info on this person. I didn't have stats that they were like very, very passive or something. I don't feel as good about checking and then like just folding to a bet or something. If I check here and face a bet, I feel like there's quite a drop because it's really, I'm not sure I want to check raise. I'm not sure I want to check fold, and I don't love check call. And that's just because random weaker players tend to stab at the sort of frequency that kind of makes me indifferent here. They're stabbing quite a lot of their made hands, but they're also stabbing quite a lot of their bluffs. In other words, I think they're playing this spot quite well. If I check, like I don't think they're playing like a completely under bluffing strategy or over bluffing strategy usually, although if I have more reads I'll be able to deviate further. So what I think is really going on here is that by betting I can start this process of just like tripling off and making people overfold here on this spot. They're going to have to call down pocket pairs to the river sometimes. I block like loads of the jack X here. I think just starting with a bet is better. And I think villain is way less likely to play optimally here against a bet than they would against a check. That's my idea. So again, I'm just comparing EV, trying to categorize my hand. I think this is closer to a bluff than anything else, and it has really nice implieds, and it's just doing like quite well. So I think this can absolutely just start betting. And on the 10 turn, it looks like a spot where double barreling is totally fine. I don't think I have to do this. I think I could check here and check fold. That would be fine as well. And then on the river, I think this is a really bad run out for range. Like, okay, now the fact that I block king jack and ace jack might actually be a bad thing. These may be the hands that are falling in the river. So one of the skills with ace king, once you start bluffing it, is being aware of when you may actually have to give up. And I think this is one of these notes. So I do check, villain checks back, and we lose to the 4s this time. That's kind of sad, but at the same time, someone who's happy calling my turn c-bet with 4s might even just look me up in the river and continue to put me on a hand like ace king or ace queen. Who knows? But the point is that this river is just going to generate sets and straights galore for villain. We now have the wrong blockers. I'm not convinced that this 4 straight river is the right one to start bluffing. Going all in would be very expensive. Smaller sizes I could see being over defended. I think this is a good spot to give up, and so I did. Right guys, hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget, if you like the way we teach the game, you can get loads more formulaic courses, academic courses over at carrotcorner.com with really concisely constructed syllabuses, well put together, edited professional content over there at carrotcorner.com. Do check out our paid content, and also feel free to browse through our YouTube library. We have loads of free content on this channel, and let us know what you think about that. Let us know what kind of content you'd like to see in upcoming videos. I hope this has given you a better idea of how to handle this pesky beast of a hand, ace king, particularly in 3-bet pots. Sometimes it's a value bet, sometimes it's a bluff, sometimes it's a check or a bluff catcher. You've just got to evaluate it. I'll see you next time for more educational poker content. Bye for now.